Good morning. My name is Miss Sims, for those of you who don't know me, and I get to teach Spanish to both middle and upper school students here. If you could have dinner tonight with anybody, living or dead, who would it be? I asked several of my classes this question at the beginning of the year in an attempt to get to know the students. And after a little bit of time, we had arranged hypothetical dinner parties with the likes of Beyonce, the cast of The Office, Derrick Rose, and other celebrities. But I realized I would like to have dinner with my grandpa Niels. I never met him. He passed away before I was born. His name was Niels Schweitzer. Although I never knew Grandpa Niels, the stories that I heard growing up have been a part of my childhood and of my maturing into adulthood. Recently, I've become very curious about him, so I set out to learn more. As humans, we are wired for storytelling. It's fascinating to me how the stories that we tell about ourselves and others shape our memories, our interests, our outlooks, and our beliefs about the world. I want to share a few stories with you about my grandpa. Along the way, I hope you'll learn some things about immigration, World War II, and mid-century modern American architecture. Seniors, I understand that some of you will need to do a genealogy project for your survey class, and I hope this helps you look forward to that. In the process of preparing for this chapel talk, I interviewed my grandma Bev, and she is one of the best storytellers I know. That hour-and-a-half conversation I had with her was one of the sweetest moments in my relationship with her. My grandpa, Niels Schweitzer, was born in 1926 to parents who were immigrants from Switzerland. His mother, who I have heard called Mutti, spent her time raising her three boys. Niels was the oldest and the tallest in this picture, followed by Hans, and Mark was their youngest brother. His father was a remarkably educated man. He had a PhD in agriculture and worked on various farms around the Washington, D.C. area. After my grandpa was born, Großpapa, is what we called his dad, earned a second doctoral degree in German poetry, and he taught German at the University of Maryland. When my grandpa Niels began school, he couldn't speak English because he spoke Swiss German at home. His kindergarten teacher painstakingly taught him songs in English and the alphabet. He was not held back for long, however, and soon proved to be an extremely bright and capable student. Niels grew up in a home that delighted in art, music, and beauty. Großpapa would take Niels and the other boys to D.C. to visit various museums. Instead of walking around the entire museum and looking at everything, they would sit in front of a particular painting or piece and analyze it for long periods of time and discuss it. Großpapa introduced Niels to the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright. Perhaps you might know this name, but in case you don't, I want to tell you a few important things about him. Frank Lloyd Wright is considered America's greatest architect. He is known for his attention to detail and would often design pieces of furniture, light fixtures, and stained glass in the homes that he designed. His signature style of organic architecture seeks to design a building that fits naturally and beautifully into the environment surrounding it. His best-known work of art is the house Falling Water, located in Pennsylvania. My grandpa, still a teenager, went to visit this house. When he arrived, however, he realized that it was closed to public viewing, so he found his own way in. I suppose he trespassed, and he waded up the creek in order to get close to the house and see it. Little did he know that the architect of that house would play an important role later in his life. For a while, Niels intended to pursue a career as a Presbyterian minister. He was a man of strong faith, and his own minister had been impactful in his life. Things changed drastically, however, when he enlisted to serve in World War II at the age of 17. We have a collection of his letters to home, stories, poems, and illustrations from his time in the war. His spirits were high and optimistic at first, resonating with the noble patriotism that characterized the beginning of the war. As he wrote in the caption of the previous photo, "Now is the time for all good men to come to the aid of their country." But as the war dragged on, his spirits fell, and the reality of the evil and wickedness in the world was oppressive to him. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge in late 1944 into early 1945. He also took part in liberating the Holocaust concentration camp of Bergen-Belsen. He rarely talked about the war, but once he told my grandmother about this experience of liberating the camp. It was very cold. Frozen bodies were stacked shoulder high like cordwood on both sides of the road, and the men who were in that camp didn't even look human. He felt that he couldn't be a minister after so closely confronting the problem of evil. The curtain closed on that aspiration, at least for now. There are some lighthearted stories from his time in the war, however, and I loved hearing these when I was young, growing up. One time he found 2 eggs in an abandoned nest and carefully nestled those precious eggs in his helmet, along with some syrup packets he had saved from his K rations, hoping to find some flour to make real pancakes. Sure enough, upon searching some more, he found a jar of white flour in another abandoned farmhouse and settled down to make his pancakes in his army-issued frying pan. He watched and waited carefully to flip those often dreamed of pancakes. The flip was perfect, but the pancakes landed with a thud and cracked open. His flour had turned out to be plaster of Paris. He wasted those eggs. Toward the end of the war, he was going over a hill in a jeep and found a whole army of German troops waving white flags of surrender. They were so afraid of being captured by the Russians, they marched miles to reach an American outpost. As a staff sergeant, he was the highest in command at that moment with his troops, and he slowly drove back into camp, followed by an entire surrendering German troop. And it's amazing to think about that when you realize that he was not even 21. After the war, Niels decided to apply to study with Frank Lloyd Wright, so he wrote him a letter. In reply, he received a telegram from Mr. Wright that said only 2 words, "Come ahead." He was soon there, and one day while he was scrubbing the floors at the school, he looked up and saw a pair of black leather shoes, and there was Mr. Wright. He studied under Frank Lloyd Wright for 7 years. During the winter, students work and live at Taliesin West in Arizona, and in the summer, they live at Taliesin East in Wisconsin, and the school still functions today as a school of architecture. Fun fact, you can visit a Frank Lloyd Wright house in Arkansas. At Crystal Bridges, the art museum we have in Northwest Arkansas, there is a Frank Lloyd Wright house that they acquired in 2013. It was damaged by flooding, and they took it apart piece by piece and shipped it to Arkansas, and I have yet to go visit, but I plan to see it this fall. After these years of study, my grandpa moved to Central Florida to oversee the construction of Florida Southern College, which was a project of Frank Lloyd Wright. It was during this time that he met my grandmother. This is an auditorium that my grandpa designed on the college campus. And I don't have any pictures of them when they were younger, so I apologize. So they were both involved in a community theater and were cast in roles alongside each other. My grandmother said that the night she met my grandpa, she went home and told her mother that she had just met the most amazing man. She said, "He's much too old for me, but if there's one like him, that means there's another one out there somewhere." He was almost 10 years older than her, which was quite unusual for the time. After their rehearsals and shows, the group of actors would go out for coffee. However, neither of them drank coffee, so they would go to her house and have tea instead. Their first date was for her 18th birthday. They dated for several years and were married after she graduated from college at the age of 20. Grandpa Niels designed a house for them to live in outside of Orlando, which they moved into after having their 3rd child, my Aunt Kira. My Uncle Garth, my Uncle Kevin, Aunt Kira, my lovely mom, and my Uncle David all grew up there, and it was in this house on a lake. During this time, he spent a lot of time designing and working on buildings. Although he designed all types of buildings, he especially loved to design churches. In fact, my mom was married in a church that her dad had designed. My mom said that she could easily connect with her dad when she played tennis with him, starting around age 11. She remembers him for his creativity and for the elaborate stories he would tell her and her siblings. One weekend, while Grandpa Niels was working at a church, he attended a church retreat that was held at a prison. He was so moved by the ministry to men in prison that he came home to my Grandma Bev and told her, "I know what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to work in prisons." He was one of the founding members of Kairos Prison Ministry, which is now in 38 states and in 14 other countries. My grandfather was diagnosed with lung cancer in 1985. After receiving the devastating news, my grandmother called the doctor, who was a friend of hers, and said, "I need to know how to think." He replied, "All I can tell you is that 99 out of 100 people with this diagnosis are going to die in 6 months." But Grandpa Niels lived for another 3 years. It's interesting to me that at the end of his life, he returned somewhat to his former desire to be a minister through his work with Kairos Prison Ministry and by becoming a minister of the Eucharist through his church. He poured himself into his career and into ministry. He would have radiation treatment at 7:30 in the morning and then go to work. He just kept going for a long time. My mom relates the story of sitting with her father in his final moments of life. After he had passed, my grandmother quoted Psalm 23 from memory, which starts, as you know, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Grandma Bev said that while we should be able to speak freely in prayer, there is something about times of distress that cause us to fall back onto prayers that we have memorized. My grandfather's legacy lives on through the architectural community in Central Florida. It lives on in Kairos, the prison ministry that he helped found. It lives on in my aunt, my mom, my uncles, my cousins, who have become nurses, architects, professional surfers, lawyers, musicians, and a Spanish teacher. I have some questions for you. Do you know your grandparents? Do you really know them? Have you ever sat down with them to ask about their lives, to ask what they did when they were your age, to ask about the first time they fell in love, or to see if they've accomplished all the things they set out to accomplish in their lives? I believe that the days on which I call my grandparents or send them a note in the mail, that could be the most important thing I do that day. Consider honoring and investing in their lives more intentionally. What is their story? What is your story? I want to leave you with a quotation by author Donald Miller. He said, "Life cannot be understood flat on a page. It has to be lived. A person has to get out of his head, has to fall in love, has to memorize poems, has to jump off bridges into rivers, has to stand in an empty desert and whisper sonnets under his breath. We get one story, you and I, and only one story. God has established the elements, the setting, and the climax and resolution. It would be a crime not to venture out, wouldn't it?" Thank you.